Imagine a world where your worth was measured by your husband's whim, a time when your very voice, if it dared to speak out of turn, could lead to dire consequences. What if your cries for help echoed only in the silent chambers of your own heart, unheard by a world that believed your suffering was your lot? What if escaping your tormentor meant homelessness, destitution, or worse? This was the stark reality for countless women living in abusive marriages in 870. Add Number 1. The soul-crushing weight of psychological trauma and despair. The silent suffering of women in abusive marriages during the Anglo-Saxon period, around 870-odd, was not just about the bruises that faded or the bones that mended. Burrowed deep into the very core of their being, corrupting their spirit and eroding their sense of self, with a relentless psychological trauma that left scars unseen but deeply felt. Imagine a woman, perhaps named Æthelthryth, waking each morning to the chilling knowledge that her day would be governed not by the sun's steady climb or the rhythm of her tasks, but by the unpredictable mood swings of her husband, Beowulf. His anger was a storm on the horizon, ever present, ever threatening, and she never knew when it would break. This constant state of vigilance, this perpetual walking on eggshells, was a profound source of psychological distress. Her mind, once perhaps brimming with the simple joys of life, the beauty of the harvest moon or the laughter of her children, became a fortress of fear. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered word from Beowulf was scrutinized, analyzed for hidden meanings, for signs of displeasure that could ignite his wrath. The fear was a cold companion that never left her side, clinging to her like the damp morning mist. She might spend hours reliving past humiliations, the cutting remarks that sliced deeper than any knife, the public shaming that stripped her of dignity before neighbors and servants. Each memory was a barb tearing at her already frayed nerves. She would recall the time Beowulf had scoffed at her weaving, even though it was her most intricate work, declaring it fit only for pigs. Or the day he had openly admired another woman's beauty in the village square, then turned to Æthelthryth with a sneer, telling her she was aging poorly and losing her luster. These words, delivered with malice, were designed to diminish her, to make her feel worthless, unattractive, and utterly alone. Over time, these verbal assaults chipped away at her self-esteem, leaving her believing the very lies he propagated about her. She began to see herself through his eyes, a flawed, inadequate creature, undeserving of kindness or respect. This self-degradation was a cruel victory for the abuser, as it meant she had internalized his abuse, becoming her own tormentor even in his absence. The insidious nature of psychological abuse also manifested as a profound sense of powerlessness. Æthelthryth, like many women of her era, had few avenues for escape or redress. Her life was entirely dependent on Beowulf. He controlled their land, their food, their shelter, and her very existence within the household. This lack of control, this utter dependence on a capricious and cruel individual, bred a deep despair. What hope could there be when every path forward seemed blocked, every door closed? The future stretched before her an endless expanse of similar days, each filled with the same suffocating fear and the same soul-crushing humiliation. The weight of this despair was immense, often leading to a profound sadness that bordered on an enduring sorrow. She might find herself weeping silently into her pillow at night, the tears a testament to the pain she could not express aloud. Her appetite might wane, her sleep might be restless, haunted by nightmares of Beowulf's rage. These physical manifestations of her emotional torment were commonplace among women in such situations. Furthermore, the psychological toll included a pervasive sense of loneliness, even when surrounded by family. Who could she confide in? Her children were too young to understand, and she would never burden them with such a heavy truth. Her female relatives, if any were close by, might offer sympathy, but practical solutions were scarce. Society, steeped in patriarchal norms, often viewed a husband's dominion over his wife as his right, even if it involved harshness. The laws of the land, though sometimes offering theoretical protections, were often difficult to enforce for a woman without significant backing or resources. So Æthelthryth was trapped in a silent cage, her mind a prison of her own making, reinforced by the bars of societal expectation and fear. The despair grew from this isolation, from the knowledge that her pain was hers alone to bear, a secret burden that would weigh her down until her final breath. This psychological suffering, the constant erosion of self-worth, the pervasive fear, and the profound despair was arguably the most enduring and destructive form of abuse, leaving a legacy of shattered spirits long after any physical wounds had healed. Number 2. The crushing burden of shame and stigma. In the Anglo-Saxon world of 870 AD, a woman's honor was intertwined with her husband's reputation and the perceived harmony of her household. When a woman like Alara found herself enduring an abusive marriage, the burden of shame and stigma was often as heavy, if not heavier, than the physical pain. Society, then, a tightly knit tapestry of kinship and community, often placed the blame for marital discord squarely on the woman's shoulders. If her husband was prone to outbursts of violence or a steady stream of verbal cruelty, the whispers would inevitably begin. What did she do to provoke him? A good wife keeps her husband happy. These were the unspoken questions, the subtle accusations that hung in the air, creating a suffocating cloud of judgment around the victim. Alara might find herself avoiding the village market, her gaze fixed on the ground, lest she encounter the knowing glances of other women, the averted eyes of men, all of whom seemed to silently condemn her. She feared their pity, almost as much as their scorn. For pity implied her failure, her inability to maintain the domestic peace that was considered a woman's primary duty. The concept of family honor was paramount in Anglo-Saxon society, a point highlighted in historical accounts that discuss the importance of good repute within the kindred group. An abusive marriage, if its nature became known, was seen as a stain not only on the immediate couple but on both their families. For the wife, revealing the abuse was akin to exposing her family to dishonor. Parents might face questions about how they raised their daughter or why they had allowed such a match to occur. Her siblings might suffer from the reflected ignominy, making it harder for them to find suitable spouses. This immense pressure to maintain appearances, to keep the family's name unblemished, forced women like Alara into a deep silence. She became an actress in her own life, expertly feigning contentment, offering polite smiles and nodding in agreement, even as her heart ached and her body bore unseen marks. She learned to hide the truth behind carefully chosen words, to deflect curious questions, and to ensure that her children, too, understood the importance of silence. Children often became unwitting accomplices in this charade, learning early on that their family's troubles were not to be spoken of outside the home. The stigma also extended to her social interactions. While the idea of formal support groups is a modern construct, women in Anglo-Saxon communities did rely on networks of female kin and neighbors for emotional support and practical assistance. However, if a woman's abuse became known, these networks could fray. Some might distance themselves, fearing that the trouble would spill over to their own households. Others might offer unsolicited advice, often rooted in the belief that the wife simply needed to be more submissive, more pious, more agreeable. "Pray harder, daughter," an elder might advise, "and God will soften his heart." Such counsel, though perhaps well-intentioned, only reinforced the idea that the abuse was somehow her failing, a spiritual deficiency on her part. This isolation, born of shame, pushed women further into the shadows, making it nearly impossible to seek help even if it were available. The societal norms of the time, often rooted in deeply ingrained Christian teachings about a wife's obedience to her husband, inadvertently contributed to this culture of silence. Historical texts, such as penitential manuals from the period, sometimes addressed marital discord, but often in a way that emphasized the wife's role in maintaining harmony rather than her absolute right to be free from violence. Furthermore, the act of leaving an abusive husband, even if legally permissible in some circumstances, which was rare and fraught with difficulty, brought with it an even greater level of shame. A divorced woman, or one who had simply abandoned her marital home, was often ostracized. Her reputation would be ruined, making it nearly impossible for her to remarry, to find employment, or to regain her standing in the community. She would be seen as a woman who could not keep her household in order, a failure as a wife, perhaps even a harlot. Her children might be taken from her, or she would be forced to live in utter destitution, dependent on the charity of others, if any were willing to offer it. This extreme social penalty for escaping abuse meant that many women, even those facing severe violence, chose to endure their suffering in silence rather than face the public humiliation and social ruin that disclosure or departure would bring. The fear of this societal condemnation, the crushing weight of public opinion, and the desperate need to preserve what little honor she had left trapped her more effectively than any physical chains, forcing her to bear her shame and agonizing solitude. Number 3, the terrifying absence of legal recourse. In the chaotic landscape of 870 AD, Anglo-Saxon England was a patchwork of local customs and emerging legal codes. For a woman trapped in an abusive marriage, the concept of legal recourse was a fragile, often non-existent shield against her husband's cruelty. The laws of the time, while varying across different kingdoms and through periods, generally afforded women significantly less legal standing than men. A man was the undisputed head of his household, and his authority within his home was considered almost absolute. This meant that what transpired behind closed doors was largely seen as his private affair, beyond the intervention of external authorities, unless it escalated to an extreme public disturbance or resulted in a death. Consider the plight of Ingrid, whose husband, Wulfstan, regularly beat her. She knew, intuitively and from observation, that there was no swift justice she could seek. The idea of marital rape was not only unheard of, but conceptually impossible within the legal framework, as a husband's right to his wife's body was considered inherent in the marriage contract. While there were some provisions in Anglo-Saxon law, especially in later periods, like the reign of Alfred the Great, that offered some protection for women against violence, these were often difficult to enforce. For instance, laws might speak to a husband's responsibility not to maim his wife, but everyday beatings or emotional cruelty rarely warranted official intervention. A woman seeking justice would have to bring her case before the local reeve or the 100 court, a daunting prospect for several reasons. Firstly, she would need witnesses, and who would witness the intimate violence of a home? Her children were too young or too terrified to speak against their father. Servants, if any, often feared their master's retribution more than they sympathized with their mistress. Neighbors might hear screams, but they were often reluctant to interfere in domestic disputes, adhering to the principle of not meddling in another's household. Secondly, even if she found the courage and a witness, the legal system was heavily skewed against her. Her testimony alone might not be deemed sufficient, her word might be questioned, her character impugned. Powerful husband, especially one of high standing or wealth, could easily intimidate witnesses, bribe officials, or simply deny the accusations with impunity. The legal procedures themselves were cumbersome and intimidating. Courts were often held in the open, in public spaces, and the idea of a woman publicly airing her marital grievances was itself considered highly shameful and dishonorable, as discussed in the previous point. This societal disapproval often acted as a powerful deterrent, effectively silencing victims before they could even attempt to seek justice. The very act of appearing in court against her husband could mark her as an unruly or disobedient wife, further diminishing her already precarious social standing. Furthermore, the outcome of any successful legal action was rarely a safe escape. A woman could not simply file for divorce and move on to a new independent life. While Anglo-Saxon law did allow for divorce under certain circumstances, such as a man's inability to provide or certain grave transgressions, initiating such a separation was often a difficult and lengthy process. Even if granted, a divorced woman typically lost her rights to communal property and her standing within society. She might be sent back to her birth family, who might resent the burden, or she would face a life of destitution and social ostracism. There were no women's shelters, no state-funded support systems, no avenues for independent financial security. The choice for Ingrid, therefore, was often between enduring the abuse within the confines of her marriage or facing the terrifying prospect of utter destitution and public humiliation outside of it. The legal framework, or rather the lack of effective legal protection, offered little solace and no true escape, leaving women like her at the mercy of their abusers with virtually no recourse. This absence of formal protection meant that the physical and emotional violence she faced was not merely tolerated by society, it was by its very lack of legal censure implicitly condoned, trapping her in a cycle of suffering with no visible way out. Number 4. The unbearable weight of fear and constant anxiety for women in abusive marriages in 870. Add, daily life was a relentless exercise in managing an unbearable weight of fear and constant anxiety. It was a silent, internal torment that transcended the physical pain, a pervasive dread that never truly receded. Imagine Æthelthryth living in a small wattle and daub house in a quiet village. To an outsider, her life might seem unremarkable, filled with the usual chores of grinding grain, tending the hearth, or spinning wool. But beneath this mundane surface, Æthelthryth's inner world was a maelstrom of terror, perpetually on edge. Anticipating the next storm, her husband, Cynric, was a man of unpredictable temperament. One moment, he might be jovial, sharing a laugh with a neighbor. The next, a slight misstep from Æthelthryth, a meal overcooked, a tool misplaced, a simple question misunderstood, could ignite his fury. The sudden shifts were jarring, like walking through a landscape where the ground could open beneath her feet at any moment. This unpredictability bred a profound and debilitating anxiety. Æthelthryth's mind was constantly working, analyzing, strategizing, trying to predict the unpredictable. She learned to read the subtle cues, the tightening of his jaw, the shift in his gaze, the sudden quiet that preceded a storm. Every interaction, every word she uttered, every movement she made was carefully calculated to avoid triggering his rage. She would prepare his favorite foods with meticulous care, ensure his clothes were mended perfectly, and keep the children quiet when he was nearby. Yet, even with these efforts, she knew it was never enough. His anger was not a reaction to her actions, but an inherent part of his nature, a force that simply needed an outlet. This understanding that her fate was not truly in her hands was a terrifying realization that fueled her anxiety. She lived with the constant fear of his sudden outbursts, the dread of his raised hand, the chilling sound of his voice filled with contempt. The fear was not just of physical violence, it was also a fear of the unknown. What would happen if she displeased him so gravely that he cast her out? Where would she go? Who would take her in? Concept of social safety nets, as we understand them today, was practically non-existent. To be cast out meant destitution, possibly starvation, or a life of begging. This existential fear, coupled with the immediate threat of violence, created a state of hypervigilance. Her senses were constantly on alert, her heart often racing, her muscles tense. She might startle at sudden noises, her hands might tremble as she worked, and sleep, when it came, was often shallow and punctuated by nightmares. Quiet creak of a floorboard, the distant sound of his footsteps, even the changing light outside the window could send a jolt of terror through her, signaling his approach. This constant anxiety had a profound physical toll as well. Persistent stress, as modern understanding tells us, affects the entire body. While Æthelthryth would not have recognized these symptoms as related to her mental state, she would have suffered from chronic headaches, digestive issues, a weakened immune system, and persistent fatigue. Her body was constantly in a state of fight or flight, draining her energy reserves and leaving her feeling perpetually exhausted. The silence she maintained around her suffering was another layer of this fear. She feared what would happen if she spoke out, if she sought help. Would it only make him angrier? Would she be disbelieved? Would she bring shame upon her family? The pervasive fear of her husband's retribution, combined with the fear of societal judgment and the terrifying prospect of homelessness, kept her silent, trapped within her own terror-filled existence. Every day was a tightrope walk, over an abyss of violence and despair, and the constant fear of falling was an agony that never ceased. Number 5. The profound loss of identity. For women in abusive marriages, in 870, at one of the most insidious and heartbreaking silent sufferings was the profound loss of their own identity. Before marriage, a woman, while still constrained by societal norms, might have had a clearer sense of herself, her family, her skills, her aspirations, her unique spirit. Within an abusive marriage, her individuality was systematically eroded, leaving her a hollowed-out vessel, defined solely by her husband's narrative. Consider the story of Hild, who before her marriage to Æthelthryth was known for her quick wit, her beautiful singing voice, and her skill in crafting intricate embroidery. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a person with her own thoughts and dreams. But after years of Æthelthryth's degradation, her vibrant spirit had dimmed. He constantly belittled her intelligence, scoffed at her opinions, and ridiculed her talents. "Your songs are like a crow's squawk," he might sneer, "and your needlework is fit only for a pigsty." These words, repeated tirelessly, chipped away at her self-perception until she began to believe them herself. The abuser's goal was often to establish complete control, and to do so, he needed to dismantle his wife's independent spirit. This often involved isolating her from her family and friends, denying her access to outside influences, and controlling her interactions. Hild might have found herself increasingly cut off from her own kin, as Æthelthryth manufactured reasons for them not to visit, or simply forbade her from seeing them. Her world shrank to the confines of their shared dwelling, her only companions, the children, and often the oppressive presence of her husband. Without the affirmation and connection of others who knew and valued her for who she was, Hild's sense of self began to wither. She no longer heard her name spoken with affection, no longer saw herself reflected in the eyes of those who loved her unconditionally. Instead, she saw only the distorted reflection her husband held up to her, a reflection of inadequacy and failure. Her very thoughts and feelings became suspect. If she expressed a desire, it was dismissed as foolish. If she voiced a complaint, it was met with anger. Over time, she learned to suppress her true feelings, to hide her thoughts, to become what her husband wanted her to be, silent, compliant, and invisible. Her own opinions seemed to vanish, replaced by echoes of his. She might even find herself adopting his views, simply to avoid conflict, further blurring the lines of her own identity. The vibrant young woman who loved to sing and create was slowly suffocated, replaced by a ghost of her former self, someone who existed only to serve another's needs and avoid their wrath. Her personal desires, her small joys, her hopes for the future, all were extinguished under the weight of his oppressive presence. The loss of identity, also extended to her public persona. In Anglo-Saxon society, a woman's identity was often tied to her lineage and her family's standing. But in an abusive marriage, her public image was often crafted by her husband, who might present her as docile, submissive, or even simple-minded, thereby further reducing her perceived autonomy. Hild might have felt like a puppet, performing the role of the devoted, silent wife, even as her inner self screamed for recognition. She had no space to grow, to learn, to pursue her own interests, because her existence was entirely consumed by managing her abuser's moods and fulfilling his demands. The historical understanding of the time, as evidenced by legal texts and social norms, often depicted women as property or extensions of their husbands rather than autonomous individuals. This societal framework made it easier for an abuser to strip a woman of her identity, as it was already culturally de-emphasized. The silent suffering here was the loss of who she truly was, the slow death of her spirit, leaving behind a profound emptiness that was arguably more devastating than any physical wound. Number 6. The shackles of economic dependence. In the tapestry of Anglo-Saxon life around 870 AD, where land was wealth and labor was power, women in abusive marriages faced an almost insurmountable barrier to escape: the crushing shackles of economic dependence. For a woman like Geitha, who had married into a household where her husband Redwulf held absolute control over all resources, the very thought of leaving him was synonymous with utter destitution and starvation. Upon marriage, a woman typically brought a dowry known as morgengifa, or a mourning gift, from the husband, or property brought by her own family. However, these gifts often became entwined with the husband's family wealth, and her direct control over them could be severely limited, especially if the marriage turned sour. The reality was that a husband was the primary breadwinner and the legal owner of the land and most possessions. A wife, while essential to the household's functioning through her domestic labor, did not typically earn her own income or accrue personal wealth independent of her husband. Imagine Geitha's daily life. Her work was constant: grinding grain for bread, churning butter, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, tending the kitchen garden, preparing meals, caring for children, and maintaining the hearth. This labor was vital for the survival of the family, yet it was unpaid and unrecognized as having an independent economic value outside the household. If Redwulf decided to withhold food or deny her access to basic necessities, Geitha had no personal store of money or goods to fall back on. Her clothes, her shelter, her very sustenance depended entirely on him. This total reliance created a terrifying vulnerability. If she angered him, if she tried to stand up for herself, he could threaten to cut off her food, to deny her warmth, or even to turn her out of the home. These were not idle threats in a society where charity was often sporadic and formalized welfare systems were non-existent. Even if Geitha possessed a skill that could earn her a meager living, such as weaving for others or brewing ale, these activities were often limited by her husband's permission and control. He might forbid her from engaging in such work, or he might seize any earnings for himself, further cementing her economic subjugation. The idea of a woman owning land independently, especially if she was married, was rare and complex, usually confined to women of very high status or widows with inherited property. For the average woman, her economic identity was subsumed by her husband's. She could not buy or sell significant goods, enter into contracts, or manage property without his consent or often his direct involvement. This legal and social framework, while not explicitly designed to trap women in abusive situations, certainly had that devastating effect. The option of returning to her birth family, while theoretically possible, was often not a viable economic solution. Her family might already be struggling to feed their own, or they might fear the social repercussions of taking back a daughter who had failed to maintain her marriage. They might also pressure her to return to her husband, believing it was her duty and the only way to avoid the shame of a broken marriage. Even if they took her in, she would likely be dependent on them, a burden rather than an independent individual. This lack of economic autonomy meant that even in the face of brutal violence, Githa's hands were tied. She could not simply walk away and find a safe place to live or a means to support herself and her children. The fear of destitution, the terrifying prospect of homelessness and starvation, was a potent weapon in the abuser's arsenal, keeping women trapped in abusive homes more effectively than any lock or chain. The silent suffering was the constant gnawing fear of poverty, the knowledge that her very survival was tethered to the whim of her tormentor, leaving her with no agency to escape. Number 7. The crushing weight of social isolation. In the Anglo-Saxon period, around 870 odd communities were often close-knit. Yet for a woman in an abusive marriage, this very closeness could transform into a suffocating cage of social isolation. Unlike modern times, where one might find solace in anonymous spaces or connect with distant family through communication technology, a woman's world was often confined to her village, her immediate family, and her husband's kinsmen. When abuse entered the home, these connections, vital for emotional well-being, often frayed or were severed entirely. Consider the plight of Beorhthild. Her husband, Æthelthryth, an imposing and controlling man, systematically cut her off from her world. Perhaps he would forbid her from visiting her mother in a neighboring village, feigning illness or demanding her constant presence at home. He might refuse to allow her to attend communal gatherings like feasts or religious ceremonies, citing her supposed misbehavior or simply his own whims. This isolation was not always imposed by direct prohibition. Æthelthryth might spread rumors about Beorhthild to her friends and neighbors, depicting her as lazy, ill-tempered, or unstable. These whispers, once started, could quickly poison her relationships, causing others to distance themselves. People fearing Æthelthryth's wrath or simply not wanting to get involved in marital disputes would avoid Beorhthild, leaving her feeling deeply alone even amidst a bustling community. The communal well, the local market, the church, places where women typically gathered and shared news and camaraderie, might become terrifying spaces where she felt scrutinized, judged, and shunned. The very act of walking through the village might feel like running a gauntlet of silent condemnation. Her birth, family, her kin, who should have been her first line of defense, were often powerless to intervene, or worse, unwilling to do so. In a society where marriages were often alliances between families, breaking off a marriage even due to abuse could lead to complex feuds or economic repercussions. Her family might advise her to endure, to pray, to be more obedient rather than risk antagonizing her husband or the powerful family he belonged to. This left Beorhthild feeling abandoned by those who should have protected her, deepening her sense of isolation and helplessness. She might long for the simple comfort of a conversation with her sister or the familiar embrace of her mother, but these connections were denied to her, leaving her trapped within the cold walls of her marriage. The impact of this social isolation was profound. Humans are social creatures, and the denial of meaningful human connection can be as damaging as physical pain. Beorhthild might have suffered from intense loneliness, a pervasive sense of being invisible and unheard. Without external validation or someone to confide in, her perception of reality could become warped by her abuser's narrative. His gaslighting, his constant denial of her experiences, or his manipulation of her perceptions became easier to enforce when she had no outside voice to confirm her own sanity. She might start to believe that her experiences were not real, or that she was indeed the cause of her own suffering, simply because there was no one else to offer a different perspective. This internal isolation, where she was cut off even from her own sense of self, was a chilling consequence of her physical and social confinement. The silent suffering was the echoing emptiness of a life devoid of genuine connection, a soul adrift in a sea of solitude, surrounded by people yet utterly alone. Number 8. The relentless cycle of forced childbearing and lack of reproductive choice. In 870, at life was often brutal, and nowhere was this more evident for women in abusive marriages than in the relentless cycle of forced childbearing and the complete absence of reproductive choice. For a woman like Thora, trapped with a cruel husband, every pregnancy was not a joyous anticipation of new life, but a source of dread, a deepening of her bondage. Marriage in Anglo-Saxon society was primarily for procreation, to ensure the continuation of the family line and to provide labor for the household and the land. There was no concept of birth control, no readily available knowledge or means to prevent conception. Women were expected to bear as many children as possible, and a barren woman might even face social stigma or divorce. For Thora, this meant that her body was not her own. Her husband's demands for intimacy were not opportunities for connection, but another arena for his control, another act of submission she was compelled to endure. Each pregnancy brought with it immense physical risks. Childbirth in the Anglo-Saxon era was incredibly dangerous, a leading cause of death for women. There were no hospitals, no trained midwives as we understand them today, and certainly no advanced medical interventions. A difficult labor could mean death for both mother and child. Imagine Thora, weakened by repeated pregnancies, her body never fully recovering before the next one began. She would have suffered from chronic exhaustion, nutrient deficiencies, and the physical toll of carrying and delivering many children. Each delivery was a terrifying gamble with her life, often endured with minimal support and intense pain. For a woman in an abusive marriage, this vulnerability was amplified. Her husband might show no compassion during her pregnancies or during labor, treating her as little more than a vessel for his offspring. He might demand her continued labor, even when she was heavy with child, or deny her proper rest after childbirth, viewing her as merely a means to an end. Constant cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing meant that Thora had no respite, no time to herself, no opportunity to recover her strength or her spirit. She was perpetually pregnant, nursing, or caring for infants, a ceaseless demand on her already depleted resources. This continuous physical strain, combined with the emotional and psychological abuse she suffered, created a crushing burden. Furthermore, the children themselves, while cherished, often became additional liabilities. An abusive husband might use the children as leverage, threatening to harm them or deny the mother access to them if she did not comply with his demands. Thora's love for her children, while a powerful motivator, also became a powerful chain binding her ever more tightly to her abuser. She would endure endless suffering if it meant protecting her children from his wrath or ensuring their survival. The idea of reproductive rights was entirely alien to the Anglo-Saxon worldview. A woman's body was considered subservient to her husband's desires in the needs of the family line. Abortion, if attempted, was dangerous and often considered a grave sin punishable by severe penalties. The use of herbal remedies for contraception or abortion, while perhaps whispered about among women, was fraught with risk and largely ineffective. This meant that Thora had no control over her own fertility, no agency over her own body. She was perpetually at the mercy of her husband's desires and the biological imperative to reproduce. This relentless cycle, imposed upon her without her consent, was a profound and silent suffering, reducing her to a reproductive machine, stripped of her autonomy, and condemned to a life of physical hardship and terrifying risk, all while enduring the constant abuse of her marriage. Number 9. The brutal reality of physical abuse in the harsh world of 870 AD. For women trapped in abusive marriages, the silent suffering often manifested in the most brutal and undeniable way: recurrent physical abuse. This was not merely an occasional outburst of temper, but a pervasive, terrifying reality that dictated their daily existence. Imagine the life of Brynhild, whose husband Orm, viewed his home as his domain and her as his property, to be controlled through fear and violence. His physical attacks were not always public. Indeed, they were meticulously hidden, often occurring within the confines of their dwelling, away from the eyes of neighbors or the community. The blows might land on parts of her body that could be easily covered by the simple woolen clothes she wore. Her back, her legs, her torso. Yet, the pain was undeniable. The bruises, a silent testament to his brutality. These beatings were not just random acts of violence. They were often calculated tools of control. Worm might strike Brynhild for perceived disobedience, for speaking out of turn for a meal that was not to his liking, or simply for questioning his authority. The purpose was to instill terror, to ensure her complete submission, to break her spirit so thoroughly that she would never again dare to challenge him. The physical assaults might range from slaps and shoves to brutal kicks and punches, leaving Brynhild with black eyes, swollen lips, broken teeth, or even fractured bones. She would suffer in silence, patching her wounds with whatever herbal remedies she knew, hiding her pain behind a stoic facade. The sight of her own blood, the throbbing pain, the lingering aches, these were her constant companions, reminders of her helplessness. The danger of these physical assaults was compounded by the complete lack of medical care available. There were no hospitals, no trained doctors to set broken bones or treat severe internal injuries. A deep cut could lead to fatal infection. A severe blow to the head could cause lasting damage or death. Brynhild might bear the scars of old injuries, the crooked finger, the persistent limp, the faint marks on her face visible only to her own careful inspection in the dim light of dawn. These were her secret maps of pain, etched onto her very flesh. She would learn to endure, to numb herself to the pain, to push through her daily chores despite the agony, for to stop would mean facing his wrath again. The fear of the next blow was a constant shadow. Brynhild lived in perpetual anticipation, her body tensed, her mind racing, trying to avoid triggering his rage. She would develop a heightened sense of awareness, listening for his footsteps, interpreting his tone of voice, trying to anticipate his mood swings. Even when he was not physically violent, the threat of it hung heavy in the air, a sword perpetually dangling over her head. This constant state of fear meant that her body never truly relaxed, and her mind was always on high alert, a taxing and exhausting existence. Historical accounts and legal codes of the time, while sometimes mentioning physical harm, largely viewed a man's correction of his wife as his right. There was no widespread concept of domestic violence as a crime that society needed to prevent or punish severely. This lack of legal protection or social condemnation meant that women like Brynhild were left utterly exposed, with no one to turn to and no safe haven. The silent suffering with the endless procession of pain, the unseen bruises, the mended bones that whispered of past torments, and the ever-present dread of the next inevitable assault. Number 10. The inescapable bonds of societal expectation. In the rigid social structure of 870-odd, the silent suffering of women in abusive marriages was often deeply rooted in the inescapable bonds of societal expectation. From the moment a girl was born, her path was largely predetermined, shaped by the pervasive norms and values of Anglo-Saxon culture. Her primary role was to be a wife and a mother, to manage the household, and to produce heirs. Disobedience to her father and then, upon marriage, to her husband, was considered a serious transgression against the natural order, not just a personal failing. This deeply ingrained cultural belief served as an invisible yet incredibly powerful chain that bound women to even the most abusive of marriages. Consider the world of Æthelthryth, a young woman who entered marriage with expectations of a harmonious household, as dictated by the songs and stories of her youth. However, when her husband, Thorgil, proved to be cruel and violent, she found herself caught in a trap, meticulously crafted by society itself. The expectations began even before the marriage. Marriages were often arranged not out of love, but for economic, political, or social alliances between families. A woman's consent, while sometimes acknowledged, was often secondary to the needs of her family and community. Once the marriage vows were exchanged, these societal expectations intensified. A wife was expected to be subservient to her husband, to honor and obey him, and to maintain the peace and order of the household at all costs. This expectation was reinforced by religious teachings of the time, which often interpreted biblical texts to emphasize a wife's submission to her husband. If a marriage was troubled, the unspoken assumption was often that the wife had failed in her duties, that she was not sufficiently docile, pious, or hard-working. The burden of fixing the marital discord, or at least concealing it, fell squarely on her shoulders. Aelsheld understood these expectations intimately. To complain about her husband, to reveal his cruelty, would not only bring shame upon herself, but also upon her birth family, who might be seen as having raised an unruly or disobedient daughter. Her failure to maintain a peaceful marriage would be viewed as a failure of her character, and possibly even a spiritual failing. Neighbors and community members, adhering to these same norms, would be unlikely to intervene. Instead, they might offer platitudes about a wife's duty, or suggest she simply try harder to please her husband. There was no concept of a bad husband in the modern sense that would warrant societal intervention. Rather, it was often assumed that the wife was somehow at fault, or that the husband was merely exercising his rightful authority, however harshly. The societal expectation that a marriage should last until death, or at least until legally dissolved through specific difficult avenues, meant that abandoning her husband even to escape abuse was virtually unthinkable. A woman who left her husband would be an outcast, losing her social standing, her potential for remarriage, and her ability to support herself or her children, as previously mentioned regarding economic dependence. Her reputation would be ruined, and she would face a life of destitution and public humiliation. This societal pressure was so immense that many women, like Aelsheld, found it easier to endure the daily horrors of an abusive marriage than to face the devastating consequences of defying cultural norms. They internalized the shame, believed the accusations against them, and blamed themselves for their suffering, all because society had taught them that their primary duty was to maintain the facade of a harmonious marriage, no matter the cost, to their own well-being. The silent suffering here was the crushing weight of an entire society's expectations, forcing women to silently endure unimaginable pain rather than face the ruin of their reputation and the loss of their place in the world.